The events of November 3, 1979, would forever haunt the town of Greensboro, North Carolina. On that day, members of the Communist Workers' Party gathered in Greensboro, North Carolina, to organize textile mill workers and protest the growing influence of the Ku Klux Klan in the area. The protest was to take place in a predominantly African American community, but as about 30 citizens, both black and white, got ready to begin the march, a group of about 35 KKK and neo-Nazi members drove up in a 9-car caravan, shooting out into the crowd. 5 people were killed that day, and another 10 wounded. 6 Klan and neo-Nazi members would go on to 2 different civil trials, only to be acquitted both times despite substantial evidence of guilt, including television footage by news stations on site, as well as testimonials from various onlookers. Finally, in a 3rd civil trial, members of the police and hate groups were found to be liable for one of the deaths, and a payment of $395,000 was required to be made to the survivors. While a terrible tragedy, the November 3rd massacre is an event arguably now buried in the past. Perhaps this is why the community of Greensboro was initially surprised and dismayed by researchers Jovanovic, Nelson, Steger, and Simmons upon their decision to reopen the topic in the early 2000s. Why would this event from approximately 20-ish years be of any relevance then, or today? And what kind of good could come out of bringing up such a painful topic, especially considering there were still survivors of this incident living in Greensboro? You see, this group observed a tension present in Greensboro's community and believed it could be traced back to the massacre all those years ago. They saw this present in lingering racial and economic tensions, believing that the city of Greensboro lived in the shadow of that day. The group operated on the theory that Greensboro had never truly reconciled themselves with this incident, in speech or in practice, and lived with it as an ever-present elephant in the room. This led the group of researchers to found the Greensboro Truth and Community Reconciliation Project, GTCRP for short. Their hope was to initiate dialogue about November 3, 1979, that would take into account all of the relevant factors, many of which never were entered into public record or public conversation over the years. And so from January 2003 to July 2004, the GTCRP committee set out on a giant community reconciliation project, hoping that by engaging all voices and not just a favored few, communication could be used to eventually bring the city to some kind of peace about the situation. The GTCRP began to, in their words, do justice. They began by hosting a graduate seminar called Communication and Social Change, encouraging students to seek out change both within established community institutions and through grassroots methods. The course explored 6 broad areas that included ethics, social justice, democratic theory, individualism versus collectivism tensions, the role of communication in community formation, and finally the moral imperative of social action research. Next, a research team developed a questionnaire to assess community members' knowledge of the 1979 event and the GTCRP. Finally, a task force set out to find the stories behind the story of that day. The group believed there were 2 stories present regarding the event, that there was the dominant narrative, in other words, the most widely accepted story of that day, and another side. The dominant and long upheld narrative of November 3, 1979 was that the 2 extremist groups from outside the city collided in an unfortunate, violent shootout. However, the group theorized that there was another, alternative narrative. This side of the story described November 3rd as a massacre of community members, planned with the knowledge of local law enforcement agencies, and that victims were deprived of their constitutional right to protection in assembling to express their views. Through conversations within the community, the GTCRP found that the second view seemed to be the narrative voiced by survivors and their supporters, but not those in power. Of course, with any argument, there were community supporters of the Greensboro Reconciliation Project and those that were against it. Supporters agreed that November 3, 1979 had left Greensboro broken and divided, and democracy pushed to the wayside. In their eyes, any attempt to try and understand and come to a resolution would be good to the city. Arguers against the project touted it as ancient history and believed there was no legitimate reason to bring it up. Why put out the impression that Greensboro is racist? The problem with those who did disagree with the effort was that no matter the argument, there was a logistical community issue in the city. An ever-widening divide had opened between the rich and the poor in Greensboro. Although the civil rights movement was in the past, school segregation still occurred as the result of residential housing patterns that divided the city's deteriorating east side, populated primarily by African Americans, from the more prosperous white suburban west side. There was a disparity among races in healthcare, and the infant mortality rate was only about 6% for whites, while it was at 14% for minority babies, over double. In the end, the GTCRP committee considered their project a success. Once they reached out of their safe zones and got involved at the ground level, they were able to initiate community change through a 3-pronged approach of education, community organization, and questioning. Through dialogue, the city of Greensboro was able to retell the many stories of November 3rd over the course of a year and to come to a better resolution of the tragedy. The community concluded their findings with the following words: "If it is in speaking their word the people, by naming the world, transform it, dialogue imposes itself as the way by which they achieve significance as human beings. Dialogue is thus an existential necessity." As we close out, think about dialogue in your own life and how it influences your world and your community. Consider how language, the words we say and the stories we tell, have the potential to change reality and what you would change if given the opportunity.